The rise and fall of a ruthless ruler. How Saddam Hussein built, and lost, absolute power. In the final decades of the 20th century, one man held a nation of 25 million people in an iron grip. He commanded armies. He signed death warrants over breakfast. He had his face painted on the side of buildings, woven into carpets, stamped onto wristwatches, pressed into the coins his people spent to buy bread. He ended, hiding alone, in a dirt hole, 8 feet underground, clutching $750,000 in cash and a pistol he never used. No last stand. No defiant speech. No martyrdom. Just a man in a hole. The question this film asks is not simply what happened. It is, how? How does a system of absolute power, one of the most elaborate, well-funded, and brutally enforced authoritarian structures of the modern era, collapse so completely, so quickly, that the man at its center cannot even mount a defense? The answer, as we will see, was there from the beginning. To understand how Saddam Hussein built power, you must first understand where he came from, and what that place taught him. He was born on April 28, 1937, in the village of Al-Ajah, on the outskirts of Tikrit, a provincial town in central Iraq roughly 150 kilometers north of Baghdad. The circumstances were not romantic. His father, Hussein al-Majid, died or disappeared before Saddam was born, depending on which account you believe. His mother, Suba Tulfa, remarried a man named Ibrahim Hassan, a figure who, by most accounts, was hostile to the young boy under his roof. Ibrahim was reportedly physically abusive, called Saddam a son of a dog, and made his stepson feel the precariousness of life without status, without protection, without a place in the world that was truly his. This is not to suggest that childhood trauma determines destiny. Most people who suffer difficult upbringings do not become dictators. But the specific contours of Saddam's early life, the absence of a father, the presence of a hostile authority figure, the reliance on an uncle named Karala Tulfa, shaped the way he understood power for the rest of his life. Karala Tulfa was the formative influence. A former Iraqi army officer who had been imprisoned by the British for supporting the 1941 pro-Axis coup attempt, Karala was a committed Arab nationalist, politically charged, resentful of foreign domination, and deeply admiring of strength. He would later write a pamphlet, almost laughably explicit in retrospect, titled "Three Whom God Should Not Have Created: Persians, Jews, and Flies." At age 10, Saddam moved to Baghdad to live with his uncle. There, for the first time, he encountered the machinery of political aspiration. He was an average student, by most accounts, but a sharp observer of power. He failed the entrance examination for the Baghdad Military Academy, a rejection that stung, because in the Arab nationalist milieu of the 1950s, military service was the most direct path to prestige and authority. He found another path. The 1950s in Iraq were a decade of extraordinary political turbulence. King Faisal II sat on a monarchy heavily influenced by British interests. Arab nationalism, inspired in part by Egypt's Gamal Abdel Nasser, was a growing and impassioned force, particularly among educated young men who wanted Iraq to control its own destiny, its own oil, its own future. The Middle East in the 1950s was not a vacuum. It was a chessboard. The United States and Soviet Union competed aggressively for influence in the region, supporting governments, political movements, and coups that aligned with their strategic interests. Arab nationalism complicated this competition. It was neither fully pro-Western nor pro-Soviet. Iraq's oil wealth made it an especially high-stakes arena. Into this environment stepped a young man from Tikrit with no money, no military rank, and no family connections in the capital, but with a ferocious will to belong to something that mattered. In 1957, at the age of 20, Saddam Hussein joined the Arab Socialist Ba'ath Party. It was one of the most consequential decisions in the history of the modern Middle East. From street operative to absolute ruler. The Ba'ath Party, whose name translates roughly as Renaissance or Resurrection, was founded in Damascus in the 1940s by Syrian intellectuals Michel Aflaq and Salah al-Din al-Baitar. Its ideology combined Arab nationalism, socialism, and secularism into a single program: unite the Arab world, expel foreign influence, and build strong, modern states. In 1958, the Iraqi monarchy was overthrown in a military coup led by General Abd al-Karim Qasim. The king was killed. British influence was formally severed. Iraq declared itself a republic. But Qasim did not share Ba'athist ambitions for pan-Arab unity. He was a nationalist of a different kind, Iraqi first, Arab second. To the Ba'athists, this was betrayal. The party decided he had to go. In October 1959, a team of Ba'athist operatives attempted to assassinate Qasim on a Baghdad street. Saddam Hussein, 22 years old and still a junior party member, was part of the hit squad. The assassination failed. Qasim was wounded but survived. Saddam was shot in the leg, possibly by friendly fire, and made a dramatic escape. First to Tikrit, then across the desert to Syria, then to Egypt, where he spent 3 years in exile in Cairo. What matters here is not the failed assassination itself, but what it revealed about Saddam's trajectory. He was not an ideologue in any deep sense. He was an operator. He did not rise through the Ba'ath Party by writing philosophical treatises. He rose by being willing to act, to use violence as a tool, at a moment when the party needed men who could. In Egypt, he studied law intermittently, but more importantly, he consolidated his reputation within the party exile community as a young man of demonstrated commitment and nerve. He returned to Iraq in 1963 following a Ba'athist coup that finally ousted Qasim. But the Ba'ath Party's first stint in power lasted only 9 months before being displaced by rival military factions. The lesson was sharp and immediate. Seizing power and holding power were two entirely different problems. Over the next 5 years, Saddam Hussein, now a rising figure in the party's internal security apparatus, focused obsessively on the second problem. He organized the Jahaz Hanin, the party's intelligence network. He cultivated relationships with tribal leaders and military officers. He built, with quiet methodical effort, a web of loyal operatives inside the military, the bureaucracy, and the security services. On July 17, 1968, the Ba'ath Party returned to power in a nearly bloodless coup. General Ahmad Hassan al-Bakr became president. Saddam Hussein became deputy chairman of the Revolutionary Command Council, formally, the second most powerful man in Iraq. But the formal structure told only part of the story. Over the next 11 years, it was Saddam, not al-Bakr, who controlled the security services. It was Saddam who decided who was loyal and who was dangerous. It was Saddam who built the invisible architecture of surveillance and coercion that made Ba'athist rule more than just a military government. It made it a system. Al-Bakr was the face. Saddam was the mechanism. By 1979, al-Bakr was elderly and in declining health. The power transfer, when it came, was not a coup. It was a convergence, the logical endpoint of a decade of quiet accumulation. On July 16, 1979, al-Bakr announced his resignation, citing health reasons. Saddam Hussein became president of Iraq. What followed, within days, is one of the most chillingly documented scenes of authoritarian consolidation in modern history. Saddam convened a meeting of senior Ba'ath Party officials, hundreds of the most powerful men in Iraq. He took the stage, visibly emotional, and announced that a conspiracy had been uncovered. Traitors in their midst. Enemies who had sought to undermine the revolution. He then did something extraordinary. He read names aloud. One by one, as each name was called, the named individual was escorted from the room by security personnel. Those remaining, watching their colleagues disappear, began to applaud. Loudly. Desperately. Some wept. The message was precise and unmistakable. Your survival depends on your demonstrated loyalty. And I am watching. Approximately 60 senior party officials were detained. 22 were convicted of treason. Many were executed, reportedly by firing squads in which other senior party members were forced to participate, binding them to Saddam's violence through shared culpability. Power was formalized. The performance was complete. What distinguished Saddam Hussein's rule from ordinary military authoritarianism was not just its violence, though the violence was extraordinary in scale. It was the system. Saddam did not simply sit at the top of a hierarchy and issue orders. He constructed a multi-layered architecture of control, each layer reinforcing the others, designed to make resistance not just dangerous, but structurally inconceivable. Let us break down the components. Saddam's Iraq operated not one, but multiple overlapping intelligence and security services. The Mukhabarat, General Intelligence. The AMN, Internal Security, focused on the civilian population. The Istikbarat, Military Intelligence. The Special Security Organization, which reported directly to Saddam himself and surveilled all the others. This redundancy was deliberate. No single security service could become powerful enough to challenge the state, because each service was also watching the others. Officers were incentivized to report disloyalty, including the disloyalty of their colleagues in competing agencies. The result was a surveillance environment so pervasive that ordinary Iraqis could not be certain, in any conversation, whether the person they were speaking with might report them to one agency or another. Dissent was not simply punishable, it was practically irrational, because the probability of detection was high and the consequences were catastrophic. In every authoritarian system, the ruler requires not just obedience but legitimacy. Some narrative that justifies the concentration of power. Saddam's cult of personality was sophisticated in its range. He was presented simultaneously as a warrior king in the tradition of Nebuchadnezzar and Saladin, as a modern socialist nation builder, as a devout Muslim, as a simple man of the people from Tikrit. These images were contradictory, but contradiction was not the point. The point was saturation. When a leader's image is everywhere, on currency, on buildings, in schools, in living rooms, the psychological effect is normalization. The ruler becomes the background reality of daily life, as inevitable as weather. Critically, the cult also served as a loyalty test. Displaying the correct image, using the correct language, attending the correct rally, these were not optional forms of enthusiasm. They were mandatory performances of allegiance. Refusal to perform was, in itself, a marker of dangerousness. Iraq nationalized its oil industry in 1972, and the subsequent rise in oil prices following the 1973 OPEC embargo flooded the Iraqi state with revenue. At its peak in the late 1970s, this wealth funded a genuine, and genuinely significant, program of social development. Literacy rates rose. Schools and hospitals were built. Infrastructure expanded. This was not purely cynical. There were technocrats in the Ba'athist system who believed in modernization. But the political function of this wealth was essential. It allowed Saddam to distribute benefits selectively, building and maintaining networks of loyal constituencies, particularly among Sunni Arab tribes in the regions around Tikrit and the Euphrates corridor. Those who were loyal received contracts, positions, and protection. Those who were not received nothing, or worse. Power was not simply imposed. It was purchased again and again, in a continuous transaction that required the state to remain solvent. The regime's use of violence was not random. This is a crucial and often misunderstood point. Random violence produces chaos and resistance. Saddam's violence was calibrated, designed to produce specific behavioral effects in specific audiences. The execution of a senior official served as a message to other senior officials. The chemical weapons attack on Halabja in 1988, which killed thousands of Kurdish civilians, was not simply an atrocity. It was a communication. Resistance to the state carries consequences so severe as to be unthinkable. The targeting of entire families for the crimes of one member served to make disloyalty not just personally dangerous, but catastrophically so, because betrayal meant not just your own death, but the destruction of everyone you loved. Violence, in this system, was not a failure of control. It was the mechanism of control. But here is the structural paradox at the heart of every authoritarian system built on fear. The more effectively fear suppresses dissent, the less accurate information flows upward to the ruler. When officials know that bad news is dangerous, they stop delivering it. When generals know that admitting military problems will cost them their lives, they report successes that do not exist. When advisors know that disagreement means punishment, they agree with everything. The ruler, surrounded by yes-men and false reports, becomes, gradually, invisibly, disconnected from reality. This was not yet obvious in 1979. It would become fatal by 2003. In 1979, events beyond Iraq's borders fundamentally altered the strategic landscape. The Iranian Revolution toppled the Shah, who had been a powerful regional player and a key American ally. In his place came Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini and an Islamic revolutionary government that explicitly sought to export its theocratic model to neighboring Muslim countries. For Saddam Hussein, this was both a threat and an opportunity. The threat was ideological. Iraq had a Shia Muslim majority, and Khomeini's revolutionary message had an audience in Iraq's south. A Shia uprising, inspired or supported by Iran, could destabilize Ba'athist rule from within. The opportunity was strategic. Iran's military had been severely disrupted by the revolution. Thousands of officers had been purged. Equipment was in disrepair. American military support had been cut off. Iran looked, in late 1979 and 1980, like a weakened adversary. The United States, having lost its Iranian ally, was deeply concerned about Soviet influence filling the vacuum. Iraq, at this moment, was strategically useful to Washington as a counterweight to revolutionary Iran, despite being a Soviet-aligned state for much of the previous decade. This ambiguity meant that both superpowers had reasons to accommodate, rather than constrain, Saddam's regional ambitions. In September 1980, Saddam Hussein ordered the Iraqi army to invade Iran. The stated justifications were territorial, disputes over the Shatt al-Arab waterway that formed part of the border, and defensive, framing the invasion as preempting Iranian destabilization of Iraq. The actual motivations were more complex: strategic opportunism, a desire to establish Iraqi regional hegemony, and, critically, Saddam's personal calculation that a quick, decisive victory would cement his position at home. The war was neither quick nor decisive. What Saddam expected to be a 6-week campaign became an 8-year grinding attrition conflict, one of the bloodiest wars of the 20th century, with casualties estimated between 500,000 and 1 million dead on both sides. Iran proved far more resilient than anticipated. The revolutionary government channeled enormous popular energy into the war effort. Human wave attacks by poorly equipped but highly motivated Iranian forces recaptured territory and prevented the Iraqi blitzkrieg from achieving its objectives. By the mid-1980s, the war had settled into a static, horrifying pattern reminiscent of the First World War. Trenches, chemical weapons, deployed by Iraq against Iranian forces and later against Kurdish populations within Iraq itself. A generation of young men consumed. There is an important analytical point here about how authoritarian systems process military failure. In a democratic system, a costly, inconclusive war creates political accountability. Leaders face elections. Critics can speak. Strategic errors can be publicly debated. In Saddam's Iraq, none of these mechanisms existed. Military failures were reframed as victories. Generals who told the truth were replaced by generals who told Saddam what he wanted to hear. The war was absorbed into the mythology of national sacrifice rather than examined as a strategic failure. The war ended in 1988 with a ceasefire that restored roughly the pre-war status quo. Iraq had spent approximately $1 trillion, lost hundreds of thousands of soldiers, and achieved nothing it had not already possessed. What it had gained was debt. By 1990, Iraq owed enormous sums to its Gulf Arab creditors, Kuwait and Saudi Arabia most prominently, who had financed the war against Iran on the understanding that Iraq was fighting on behalf of the entire Arab Gulf. Kuwait, in Saddam's assessment, was overproducing oil in ways that depressed prices, costing Iraq billions in revenue. Kuwait was also, Saddam argued, extracting oil from the Rumaila field that straddled the Iraq-Kuwait border. And Kuwait was pressing for debt repayment rather than forgiveness. In a meeting with U.S. Ambassador April Glaspie on July 25, 1990, Saddam received what he interpreted as a green light, or at minimum, a signal of American non-interference. Glaspie told him that the United States had no opinion on Arab-Arab disputes. Whether this was a deliberate signal, a diplomatic failure, or a genuine miscommunication remains debated by historians. What is not debated is the result. On August 2, 1990, Iraqi forces invaded and occupied Kuwait. Within days, the emirate was absorbed into Iraq as its 19th province. From a narrow, short-term perspective, the logic was not entirely irrational. Controlling Kuwait meant controlling its oil wealth. It solved, at a stroke, Iraq's debt problem. It was a bold, audacious move by a leader who had spent a decade learning that audacity was often rewarded. But the calculation was catastrophically wrong in ways that reveal the most dangerous cognitive distortion of authoritarian leadership: the tendency to confuse the absence of dissent with the presence of accurate information. Nobody around Saddam was positioned to tell him that the international response would be the largest military coalition. What sanctions often do is concentrate economic pain on populations who have no mechanism for translating that pain into political change, while the ruling elite, controlling distribution networks, insulates itself from the worst effects. Saddam survived. Weakened, isolated, stripped of much of his conventional military power, but in control. And here we see one of the most instructive dynamics of authoritarian resilience. The regime adapted. Oil revenues, channeled through the UN's Oil for Food program and extensively manipulated through corruption and smuggling, kept the elite patronage networks functional. The security apparatus remained intact. The cult of personality was retooled. Saddam was reframed not as a defeated leader, but as a defiant sovereign who had resisted the greatest military power in history and survived. Between 1991 and 2003, Saddam Hussein's regime entered a phase that political scientists sometimes call sultanistic decay, the gradual deterioration of institutional capacity as power becomes increasingly personalized, patronage networks thin, and coercion must substitute for functions that incentives and legitimacy once performed. The symptoms were visible, though difficult to quantify from the outside. The professional Iraqi military, already damaged by the Iran-Iraq War and decimated in the Gulf War, was further hollowed out. Competent officers were viewed as potential threats. Promotion increasingly tracked loyalty to Saddam and his family rather than military capability. The Republican Guard, Saddam's most trusted force, received preferential treatment, but even within its ranks, the surveillance apparatus created an environment of mutual suspicion that eroded unit cohesion. The economy, strangled by sanctions, pushed the educated middle class into poverty or exile. Many of Iraq's most capable engineers, doctors, administrators, and academics left. Those who remained were demoralized. The informal networks of civil society that undergird functional governance, professional associations, civic organizations, intellectual communities, atrophied. And at the center of the system, something was changing in Saddam himself. By the late 1990s, those with access to the inner circle described a leader increasingly consumed by paranoia, increasingly isolated, increasingly reliant on a smaller and smaller circle of advisors, most of them family members from Tikrit, many of them telling him only what he wanted to hear. His two sons, Uday and Qusay, occupied positions of enormous power. Uday, the elder, was by multiple accounts erratic, violent, and feared even within the inner circle. His behavior was a source of embarrassment internationally and instability domestically, yet Saddam protected him. Family loyalty had become structural. Qusay was more controlled, commanding key security services. His ascent signaled something important. The regime was becoming dynastically oriented, narrowing even further the circle of genuine decision-making authority. In 1995, one of the most remarkable episodes of the period occurred. Hussein Kamel, Saddam's son-in-law and one of the regime's most senior figures, responsible for overseeing Iraq's weapons programs, defected to Jordan and revealed extensive information about Iraq's biological and chemical weapons programs to UN inspectors. Saddam responded with a combination of denial and misdirection internationally, and a personal appeal to his son-in-law to return. He promised forgiveness. Hussein Kamel and his brother believed him, and returned to Iraq in 1996. They were killed within days. This episode encapsulates the logic of the system in its late phase. The promise of forgiveness was a deception, a tool to eliminate a problem. The fact that Hussein Kamel believed it suggests that even senior figures within the regime were, by this stage, operating with profoundly distorted mental models of the man they served. Here we arrive at the most important structural argument of this film. Systems built on fear do not simply become less popular over time. They become less accurate. When everyone around a leader knows that bad news is dangerous, information gets filtered before it reaches the top. Reports are adjusted to match what the leader wants to believe. Military readiness assessments are inflated. Popular sentiment is misrepresented as enthusiasm. Economic data is manipulated. The leader Saddam Hussein, in this case, makes decisions based not on reality, but on a carefully curated fiction maintained by terrified subordinates. This is not a failure of intelligence, on Saddam's part or anyone else's. It is a structural property of fear-based systems. It is what they do. And by 2001, 2002, 2003, this structural distortion would prove fatal. The attacks of September 11, 2001 transformed the strategic context of the Middle East with a velocity that few anticipated. The United States, under President George W. Bush, launched a global campaign against terrorism and the states that allegedly harbored or supported it. Iraq, despite the absence of any demonstrated link between Saddam Hussein's regime and the September 11 attacks, entered the crosshairs through a confluence of factors: the administration's pre-existing interest in regime change, assertions about weapons of mass destruction, and the broader strategic logic of reshaping the Middle East. In retrospect, the intelligence case for Iraqi weapons of mass destruction was, as subsequent investigations confirmed, deeply flawed. But in the immediate post-9/11 environment, it was compelling enough, and the political will in Washington was strong enough that the path to military confrontation became difficult to reverse. There is a tragic irony in the WMD debate. Saddam Hussein, having actually possessed and used chemical and biological weapons in the 1980s, had destroyed most of these programs by the mid-1990s under UN pressure. But he refused to clearly demonstrate their absence, preferring strategic ambiguity, wanting both his neighbors and his own population to believe he retained deterrent capabilities. This ambiguity, which served his internal political needs, provided the international rationale for his downfall. On March 20, 2003, a US-led coalition invaded Iraq. What followed was, militarily, one of the most rapid conventional military victories in modern history. Baghdad fell on April 9, 2003, 20 days after the invasion began. But the most instructive analytical moment is not the fall of Baghdad itself. It is the nature of the resistance, or rather, the absence of it. The Iraqi army, numbering on paper several 100,000 soldiers, largely melted away. Units that military analysts had designated as formidable simply ceased to exist as organized fighting forces. Commanders surrendered or disappeared. The Republican Guard divisions tasked with defending Baghdad offered less resistance than many had anticipated. Why? Here is the answer that the system itself provides. An army whose officers advance through loyalty rather than competence does not fight well. An army whose soldiers have spent years in a climate of economic deprivation, political fear, and systematic dishonesty about military capability does not fight well. An army whose commanders have never developed genuine tactical initiative, because individual initiative in a fear-based system is dangerous, does not fight well when the rigid command structure above it collapses. The military's performance in 2003 was not a surprise. It was the logical consequence of how the military had been built and maintained over 20 years. Saddam Hussein himself disappeared as coalition forces entered Baghdad. For 8 months, one of the most intensively searched for individuals in the world simply vanished into the Sunni Arab heartland around Tikrit. On December 13, 2003, acting on intelligence, U.S. forces raided a farm near Ad-Dor, a village close to Tikrit. In a sealed underground chamber, a hiding place approximately 8 feet deep, equipped with a small ventilation system, they found him. Alone. Armed, but not resisting. Saddam Hussein was formally arrested. He was transferred to Iraqi custody in 2004, tried by an Iraqi special tribunal for crimes against humanity, specifically for the killing of 148 Shia men and boys from the town of Dujail following an assassination attempt in 1982, and was executed by hanging on December 30, 2006. History rarely allows for simple verdicts, and the case of Saddam Hussein is no exception. His legacy is genuinely contested, not because the facts are disputed, but because different people experienced his rule in fundamentally different ways, and because the consequences of his removal were themselves catastrophic for millions of people. Let us examine the competing interpretations honestly. There is a constituency, particularly among some Iraqi Sunni Arabs, some secular nationalists across the Arab world, and those who lived through the chaos of post-2003 Iraq, that remembers Saddam Hussein's rule with something approaching nostalgia. Their argument runs roughly as follows. Iraq under Saddam was, whatever its internal cruelties, a functioning state. Infrastructure worked. Education was accessible. Women could participate in professional life with relative freedom compared to many regional neighbors. Sectarian violence between Shia and Sunni communities, which killed tens of thousands after 2003, was suppressed. Iraq maintained its sovereignty and territorial integrity. There is empirical content in this view. It cannot simply be dismissed. The counter-argument is equally empirical, and far more extensively documented. Saddam Hussein's regime was responsible for the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people through deliberate state violence. The Anfal campaign against Kurdish populations in northern Iraq, a systematic military operation in 1986 to 1989 that involved mass killings, forced displacement, and the use of chemical weapons, killed between 50,000 and 180,000 people by various estimates. The Shia uprising of 1991 and its suppression cost tens of thousands of lives. Hundreds of thousands of political opponents, suspected dissidents, and members of targeted ethnic and religious communities were killed, tortured, or imprisoned over the course of the regime's 24 years. The Iran-Iraq War, a war of Saddam's choosing, based on his miscalculations, killed perhaps 1 million people. The critics' argument is this: the stability Saddam provided was purchased at an incalculable human cost, and his strategic decisions were ultimately the primary cause of the catastrophe that followed. But perhaps the most analytically useful lens is neither the nostalgic nor the moralistic, but the structural. Saddam Hussein built something that was, in certain respects, genuinely impressive in its engineering. A system that took a fractured, ethnically and religiously divided country, one that had experienced repeated coups and governments since its formation as a modern state, and imposed on it a degree of central control, state capacity, and national presence that few of its predecessors had achieved. He did this through a combination of strategic violence, co-optation, patronage, and the construction of a pervasive security apparatus. And for a period, roughly the late 1970s through the late 1980s, this system appeared to work. But authoritarian systems built primarily on fear contain a structural deficiency that eventually destroys them. Because they suppress honest information, they make consistently poor strategic decisions. Because they concentrate power in one individual, they have no mechanism for peaceful transition or adaptive response to failure. Because they substitute coercion for legitimate governance, they require ever-increasing levels of violence to maintain control as other tools degrade. The Iran-Iraq War was a strategic failure born of miscalculation. The Kuwait invasion was a catastrophic miscalculation. The failure to clearly demonstrate the absence of WMDs, driven by the political logic of deterrence, was a fatal miscalculation. In each case, the underlying failure was the same, a system that had destroyed its own capacity for honest self-assessment. Saddam Hussein did not simply make bad decisions. He built a system that made it structurally impossible for him to be told when his decisions were bad. We began with a contradiction. A man who ruled absolutely. A man found hiding in a hole. The contradiction resolves when you understand what absolute power actually is, and what it costs. Absolute power is not a description of strength. It is a description of a relationship between a ruler and a system. And like all systems, it has properties, some of which produce control, and some of which produce fragility. Saddam Hussein's system produced control efficiently. It suppressed opposition, eliminated rivals, cultivated loyalty through a combination of fear and reward, and made the state coextensive with the will of one man. But in doing so, it also produced a ruler who became, progressively, more isolated from the truth. Surrounded by people who could not afford to tell him that his military was weaker than he believed, that his international position was more precarious than he imagined, that the United States in 2003 was not the same United States he had managed to deter in 1991. The American invasion did not cause the collapse of Saddam's regime. It triggered a collapse that was already latent in the system's architecture. Military units that looked formidable on paper evaporated under pressure because they had been built for appearance, not performance. Officials who might have organized resistance had spent years in a culture of fear that rewarded passivity and punished initiative. Populations that might have defended the regime did not, because the regime had governed through terror, rather than through any form of genuine compact with the people it ruled. The hole in the ground near Tikrit was not simply a hiding place. It was the logical endpoint of a system that had, for 35 years, been consuming the very foundations of its own durability. The world has not run out of leaders who build systems like Saddam Hussein's. The specific circumstances differ. The specific technologies of surveillance and coercion evolve. The specific geopolitical contexts vary. But the structural logic, concentrate power, suppress dissent, eliminate rivals, control information, repeats itself across histories and geographies with remarkable consistency. And so does the structural vulnerability. Because the question is not whether absolute power can be built. History demonstrates that it can. The question, the one this story forces us to ask, is whether it can ever be stable. Systems built on the suppression of truth are systems permanently at war with reality. And reality, in the long run, does not lose. Is absolute power ever stable? Or does it always carry, from the moment of its construction, the seeds of its own destruction?